All right, we're going to continue talking about the resurrection of Jesus. As we mentioned before, there are reasons to be skeptical about it. There are reasons to think that it could possibly have happened. We've talked about the shroud. We've talked about historical, literary reasons why there might be some veracity. We've talked about heart reasons that love believes the resurrection. But we're going to address some things. We're not going to do it perfectly or exhaustively, but just a quick look at topic by topic, some objections to the resurrection. And anyway, so the first one we wanted to address is
well, we're going to look at one thing that people bring up sometimes is the fact that the Gospels have apparent discrepancies in the story of the resurrection. You know, there's 4 Gospel accounts, and there's a little bit of a variety among the 4 Gospels, and that, for some people, is a very alarming, disturbing fact. And so I thought we could look at that a little bit.
And that's fair. You know, our time in history is one in which objectivity and extreme precision, and you know, when we read history, we're expecting video camera footage, essentially, but in written form.
Yeah.
And that wasn't necessarily the standard then, or for a lot of history.
Yeah.
Anyway, so what are some of the objections? What are some of the apparent discrepancies that get listed?
Well, one of the first ones is there's a diversity of numbers given. All 4 Gospels state that the first people to go to the tomb that Sunday morning were some women that were Jesus' followers. Matthew lists Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. And we're not entirely sure who the other Mary is. There are a lot of Marys in the Gospel accounts. So he lists those 2. In Mark's Gospel, he lists Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. Luke has a larger number. Luke says Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others. So he lists 3 and says others. That means at least 5, you know. And then John's Gospel just mentions Mary Magdalene. So they all mention Mary Magdalene, but in addition to her, some of the others list more. I think that's a discrepancy that's pretty easily clarified, because none of the Gospels are emphatic in the way they state the numbers. Like, there were only 3 or there were only 4, you know. So if 5 ladies went to the tomb, and for whatever reason Mark just mentions 2 of the 5, that doesn't mean that it's a contradiction, because if you have 5 women, you also have 2, you know. So that's a matter, like you were saying. I mean, in the ancient world, that kind of precision just wasn't considered important. So I mean, the basic fact that comes through is that a group of women went to the tomb, and that's significant, because I was actually reading National Geographic magazine last week, that had an issue devoted to Jesus and first century archaeology. It was talking about the account of the women going to the tomb, and how in first century ancient Roman Empire, you know, women's testimony was not even valid in court. You know, women were not looked at as reliable witnesses, and so it would have been very unreasonable for the disciples to concoct a story of women going to the tomb and coming back with a spectacular story, because on the face of it, that would hurt their credibility. That would be making it harder for them to sell their story. And even National Geographic said the only plausible explanation for why it's recorded is because it's just the truth. Women were the first to go to the tomb. I thought it was pretty remarkable that they were willing to concede that.
It's very cool. And you'll find the same if you research this, that historians by and large will say the fact that they mentioned women being the first ones to be there and report it to the others is proof of something, because no one would make that up. You know, it would be a really poor way to convince someone that what you're saying is true. Anyway.
Yeah, and maybe we're getting a little bit ahead, but another thing that seems to push against the notion that these stories were fabricated, in each of the Gospels, the disciples themselves are all portrayed as skeptics initially.
Mm-hmm.
The women don't have an easy time convincing the disciples that what they've really seen. Luke 24:11 says they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Again, if the disciples were concocting this, it seems a little odd they would portray themselves in such negative ways, and portray themselves so stubborn and so hesitant to believe. Because if you're trying to, again, sell a product, you don't want to make yourself seem hesitant to take the product. You'd want to show yourself as just wholeheartedly embracing it the first chance you get. And again, why would they portray themselves as skeptics unless they were in fact skeptics initially?
I think that's one of my, and don't get me wrong, the Bible is a wild book, and places hard to understand, and places really personally troublesome for me. I struggle with some of the things that I read, and I don't think that's a sign of a lack of faith or a lack of love for God. I think that if we're reading it carefully, the Bible is designed to trouble us in some ways, But all that to say, one of my favorite things about the Bible is that the characters aren't portrayed as heroes. A lot of times as kids, we watch these, stories about David the hero, or Noah the hero, or Moses the hero, or Peter, or whoever, and it kind of misleads us when really the storytellers are saying, no, these guys are just as messed up as any of the rest of us. It's intended to remind us of our need for God, our dependence on Him. It's just a thoroughly realistic book. It kind of defies expectation. It's easy to open the Bible as a sacred text and think that you're going to find a whole bunch of pious, religious, morally upright people, and that is just not what the Bible is. And it's not what it was designed to be. The people writing it, the people telling the stories over the couple of thousand years of its writing, that's not the story they're telling. And that's one of my favorite things about it. It's just completely realistic, and raw and real, and it consistently portrays a God who is committed to continuing to love us anyway, Anyway, I'm sorry, that was a rabbit trail, but back to the resurrection and the apparent discrepancies in the text.
Another one that this is, I think, really more of a minor one. Some people raise questions about the timing of the women's visit to the tomb. Matthew's gospel says that the women went to the tomb at dawn. Mark's gospel says just after sunrise. Luke just says very early in the morning, and John says while it was still dark. I think that's pretty easily explained, because even today in normal conversation, when somebody says they get up at dawn, you probably wouldn't grill them as to whether they meant precisely whether the sun had come up or not. Dawn in ordinary conversation just means really early, around the same time the sun's coming up. And when it says that Mary went to the tomb when it was still dark, I mean, in all likelihood, it means that when they started out, it was dark. When they got there, it was not quite so dark anymore. So it's really not that much of a contradiction, I don't think. And I haven't really heard that used as a big objection, but I think to see that as a big objection is to just want a degree of precision that's a little unrealistic. Because that's just not how we. That's not how we communicate in ordinary conversation. We don't say 6:03 a.m. Like we speak more generally than that.
Yeah.
So,
What's another possible objection? I've heard the objection, tear down this temple in 3 days, I'll raise it up. I'll give you the sign of Jonah, 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a whale, and Friday midday to Sunday at dawn, it doesn't fit our 21st century idea of 3 days and 3 nights. So what's happening there?
yeah. Well, the ancient Jews had a slightly different way of thinking of a day. If you go back to the book of Genesis, when it's listing the days of creation, it always it says it was evening and it was morning the first day. And that seems kind of backwards to put evening first. But that's how the ancient Jews calculated the day. Like the Sabbath day, the 7th day of the week began Friday at sunset, and it lasted until Saturday at sunset. So Jesus was in the tomb, Friday, Saturday, and the first part of Sunday. So he said he would arise the 3rd day, and he the day that he left the tomb was the 3rd day. So he didn't say 72 hours. He just said on the 3rd day. So,
and I've also heard that saying that was a Jewish expression back then. That almost like see you later. We're not necessarily specifying what later is.
yeah,
We're just expressing it that way.
yeah.
That talking about the 3rd day was a common expression. But anyway.
Yeah. And I guess I'd have to go back and look this. It does say that Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And Jesus compares himself to Jonah. But I'm not sure if Jesus uses the exact phrase 3 days and 3 nights. I mean, he obviously has drawn a comparison. But I don't think to argue that Jesus is saying that he'll be in the tomb for the precise same amount of time that Jonah was in the well, I think is a little bit of a stretch, because I don't think that wasn't the point.
Right.
Another point of confusion some people raise is how many angels were at the tomb. Matthew's gospel says that an angel came and rolled the stone away and sat on the stone. And the guards are so afraid of the angel that they shake and become like dead men. And the angel talks to the women and tells them that Jesus is risen. Mark's gospel says that they go inside the tomb and see a man in the tomb sitting on the right side of the tomb, and he gives them the message to not be alarmed, that Jesus is risen. Luke's gospel says that there were 2 men in the tomb, and the message is the same each time. The son of he's not here. Why do you seek the living among the dead? And then in John's gospel, Mary Magdalene sees an angel sitting in the tomb. I'm sorry, 2 angels, but it doesn't say that they gave her the message. They just asked her why she was crying. So, as far as the number goes, I mean, again, kind of going back to the number of the women, if there were 2, then obviously there were 1. I think, without casting a shadow of doubt on the divine inspiration of the Bible, I think it's important to remember the Bible is also a very human book, and these are very human events that are being described. I mean, if you went to a tomb to to complete a burial rite for a friend of yours and you encountered an angel, it would be a very disorienting experience. And Mary Magdalene in the book of John, like, it says that when she sees the tomb with the stone rolled away, like, she just immediately goes and finds Peter and John and brings them back. So there's a lot of different possibilities. It's possible that what Matthew's describing, the women did see the angel sitting on the stone. But while they're seeing that, Mary Magdalene has already left to go get Peter and John because she's just freaked out. The stone has been rolled away. And it's possible that, one of the women saw this angel outside the tomb and, was too afraid to go inside, and the others did go inside and see the other one. There's all sorts of explanations, which are very plausible. Because if you see an angel, you're not going to be like calm and collected and cool. Like, you're going to be a little freaked out, And so it's possible that they kind of scattered a little bit when they saw this. They didn't necessarily just quietly and reverently walk inside the tomb. So that would explain some of the discrepancy of what, not a contradiction of facts, but just they actually had different experiences. Like, some of them may have gone inside, some of them may not have gone inside, some of them may have gone to grab the disciples while the others stayed. And so they very likely saw different things, and encountered different things, which to me is probably the most plausible explanation for some of those discrepancies.
And sometimes we're briefly mentioning things like Daniel said, the Bible is both human and divine. Everyone comes from different traditions of faith, either no Christian background at all, or each denomination has its precise definition of what they mean by inspiration. But I'd love to recommend to you guys a really great treatment about the paradigm through which we can view Scripture, and it's the Bible Project. They do a really great podcast, and they treated this at length, and not coming from any tradition other than the Bible's tradition itself, saying what does Scripture say about itself? How did the people who wrote it and read it originally, how did they view it, and how did they think it ought to be understood? And so it's a great one, and it can kind of help lay a good foundation for the very sorts of conversations we're having here. But were there any other objections you wanted to bring up, or?
There's some confusion too about the appearances of Jesus after the resurrection. The book of Matthew mentions Jesus appearing to the women first. The book of Mark kind of ends abruptly after they encounter the angels. The general consensus, though, is that the original ending of Mark has in all likelihood been lost. And so most English Bibles, they have a little appendix after the first few verses of the last chapter that kind of sum up the other events. So it's very possible that the original manuscript of Mark may have mentioned what Matthew mentions, but just don't necessarily have that copy. Luke's the only gospel writer who doesn't mention Jesus appearing to the women. But again, it's not necessarily a contradiction. It's just not mentioned. And then John mentions Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene by herself. I think that the fact that all the gospel writers have the women going to the tomb first, and all of them except Luke specify that Jesus actually appeared to the women first. That's the main thing that I think comes through, and it depends how you look at it. I mean, the discrepancies about whether he appeared to Mary by herself or whether to Mary and the other women. If this was being concocted, the first thing you do if you're corroborating a story to fabricate it, you would make sure there weren't any discrepancies, make sure that every little minor detail sounded the same. I mean, even in a court of law today, I mean, when witness testimony like lines up like exactly like verbatim, that can sometimes arouse suspicions that there was some kind of, conspiracy beforehand to tweak the testimony to make sure that it sounded exactly the same.
Right.
A little bit of variation in testimony actually is evidence of authenticity, and I think that's a fair thing to see when you look at the gospel account as well.
I think, just as a concluding thought, what really helps me not be troubled by these minor variations is that the people who wrote and collected and canonized these writings, they weren't troubled by these things, So if we are, it's possible that it's because we're bringing our own 21st century cultural assumptions into the reading, and
yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think, like, to use a modern analogy, like if one of your best friends died, and two of your other friends claimed that they'd seen your best friend alive again, and they were adamant that they'd seen him, and you had no reason to think they were crazy, and yet one of your friends remembered seeing him wearing like a red shirt, and one of them remembered him wearing like a blue and red shirt, you wouldn't probably cross your arms and say, well, because y'all can't agree on the shirt color, I'm not going to listen to your story. I mean, the fact they've claimed to see somebody who's alive again from the dead would overshadow the comparatively minor detail about what the shirt looked like. I mean, I think it's kind of important to keep first things first and not get hung up on the minor things.
And add to that, they then live a life of free from any apparent insanity, full of clarity of thought, and end up giving their lives for this, what they're claiming to be true. It's not the testimony of a crazy person.
Yeah.
It's someone who is really convinced they saw what they are saying they saw. And anyway.
Yeah. I mean, and we can talk about this more, but I mean, the Gospels describe Jesus as appearing to the disciples numerous times over the course of 40 days. So it's not as if everything hinges on the first few minutes of Easter Sunday, or even that particular day. I mean, there were a lot of people who encountered Jesus not that day, but weeks afterwards. So the testimony of the early church wasn't just that a few people had seen him at this particular place or that particular place. It was a whole host of people that had seen him over the course of several weeks in various places, various times, and it all kind of built up to. Paul mentions there were 500 people that had seen him at one time. Most of the gospel accounts just mention smaller meetings, but there was apparently one time he appeared to quite a crowd. And so it doesn't hinge on the precise details of Sunday morning. It's kind of a bigger story than that.
Daniel, I don't know about you, but there are days when I wonder, with my incredibly limited perspective and lack of wisdom, man, why doesn't God just instead of appearing to just the handful of folks he did, why not everybody, and why not everybody today? And I mean, there are satisfactory answers to that, I suppose, but I think it's okay to ask those questions. The times in my life, though, that I've felt the closest to God and that he's revealed himself to me the clearest have not been full of spectacle. They've just been these quiet moments where I have felt deeply impressed upon me his love for me. And those still small voice moments. He's not in the tornado or the hurricane or the what are the things that he sees first before the still small voice?
Sure, the order, but I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. for whatever reason, God just likes to do it that way. Who knows why?
I think everybody would like to see, amazing visions of the risen Christ the way the disciples did, but
and some people do.
I think the continued existence, the fact that there's a Christian church that still exists in the 21st century, I think, is really difficult to account for outside the resurrection because, obviously there's all sorts of religious communities in the world, so it's I'm not saying that only some kind of incredible miracle could explain the existence of a religious entity, but the Christian church was founded on this particular miraculous claim. That was, if you read the book of Acts, as the disciples traveled planting churches, that was the message. The word gospel meant that Jesus who had died was alive again. That was the message.
Jesus is in fact king.
Yeah, he's alive, and the fact that that message thrived in the midst of terrible persecution, both from fellow Israelites and from the Romans, and then in following generations, Rome persecuted Christians much more severely than at first. That central assertion that Jesus was alive again just never could get stamped out. That central assertion just continued to thrive despite all the persecution. And it was that belief that caused the early martyrs to not really fear death, because they actually believed that they would have a new body too, just like Jesus had come out with a glorified body. So it's really hard to account for the fearlessness of the early Christians and the fact that that Rome couldn't successfully stamp them out, and the fact that today, more Christians were killed in the 20th century than all the previous centuries combined by persecution. Today, in the midst of all that persecution, the Christian church continues to exist, and it continues to be founded on that same basic assertion that Jesus is alive. And so it's Islam, Buddhism, none of these other religions stand or fall on a truth claim regarding some kind of amazing miraculous event. They're all Judaism. That's why Christianity is a little bit different, because like C.S. Lewis pointed out in his book Miracles, you could kind of have you don't necessarily even have to believe in the miraculous to be a Buddhist or to be a follower of a lot of religions, but this miraculous truth claim is really inextricably bound up with Christianity, so it's kind of in a different category.
If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments and we can address them. Concluding thoughts?
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.